At some point, I stopped asking what my life meant. Not because I found the answer, because the question stopped feeling useful. Meaning had once been the engine of everything. Every choice pointed toward it. Every sacrifice justified by it. Every struggle softened by the promise that it would lead somewhere. When that promise faded, I expected panic. What fell instead was exposure. Without meaning as a horizon, life became immediate, unprotected. There was no future interpretation to lean on, no story waiting to redeem the present. Just this moment, without explanation. I noticed how deeply trained I was to expect payoff. Effort should convert into clarity. Pain should produce insight. Endurance should earn significance. Without those conversions, something in me felt disoriented, as if the rules had changed without warning. I tried to resurrect the old questions. What is this for? Where is this going? Who am I becoming through this? They landed flat, not unanswered, unnecessary. That realization frightened me more than uncertainty ever had. If life wasn't building toward meaning, what was I doing here? For a while, I mistook this phase for emptiness. Days felt strangely unmarked. Not bad, not good, just happening. I waited for dissatisfaction to arrive. It didn't. I waited for motivation to disappear. It didn't. It simply changed shape. I continued living, working, speaking, choosing, but without the internal narration that framed everything as part of a larger arc. The absence felt unnatural, then quietly relieving. I began to see how often meaning functions as a buffer. It softens disappointment, justifies delay, explains why suffering should be tolerated. Without it, life offers no excuses. If something felt wrong, it was wrong, not a lesson. If something felt right, it was right, not a step. That simplicity felt dangerous. Too direct. I noticed how often people ask each other why. Why this job? Why this place? Why this relationship? They weren't curious. They were searching for legitimacy. Without a meaning-based narrative, my answers became shorter. I wanna. I don't. This works. This doesn't. Some people found that unsettling. I understood why. Meaning creates hierarchy. It ranks lives. It turns choices into statements. Without it, decisions become local, contextual, human. I stopped measuring my days, not tracking productivity, not evaluating fulfillment, not searching for themes. Days no longer needed to prove themselves. They simply occurred. At first, I worried this was avoidance, a refusal to engage deeply. But the opposite was true. Without the shield of meaning, experience became sharper, more exposed. Joy felt lighter. Pain felt heavier. There was no framework to absorb either. Everything landed directly. I learned that meaning doesn't deepen life. It interprets it. Depth comes from contact. There were moments of fear. If nothing was building toward anything, could I drift forever? Could I waste my life without noticing? The fear was familiar. It was the voice of supervision, the need to be monitored by a future self. I let that voice speak. Then I let it pass. I realized that I had lived most of my life under surveillance. Not external, internal. A constant watcher, evaluating progress. Meaning had been its language. Without it, something relaxed. Not ambition. Control. I wasn't trying to arrive anywhere. I was staying. That was new. One afternoon, sitting quietly, I noticed something subtle. I wasn't hoping for anything. Not because I was hopeless. Because nothing felt missing. That neutrality felt unsettling, then peaceful. I remembered how often hope had functioned as dissatisfaction in disguise. A way of postponing contentment. A way of enduring what I didn't want to be present for. Now, without hope, presence felt unavoidable. This didn't make life ecstatic. It made it honest. I paid attention to smaller signals. Fatigue. I rested. Curiosity. I followed it briefly. Resistance. I listened. There was no meaning to extract. Only information. I began to trust immediacy. Not impulse. Immediacy. The quiet knowing that doesn't explain itself. I stopped asking if my life mattered. The question itself had been abstract. Life doesn't matter. It happens. And how you meet it determines everything. That thought didn't depress me. It grounded me. I realized how much pressure meaning had placed on existence. Every moment had been auditioning for significance. Now, moments were free to be small, forgettable, ordinary. I stayed with ordinary longer than I ever had before, long enough for it to reveal texture, rhythm, subtle pleasure. This phase didn't feel like enlightenment. It felt like removal. The removal of expectation. The removal of justification. The removal of narrative protection. And in that removal, something fragile emerged. Freedom without promise. I didn't know what would come next. For the first time, that uncertainty didn't demand resolution. It simply existed. I sensed that the real challenge of this phase wasn't despair. It was temptation. The temptation to reintroduce meaning just to feel oriented again. That test hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it approaching. Quietly. The temptation arrived quietly. Not as despair, not as confusion, as usefulness. After living without meaning for some time, I noticed how often the world invited it back in. Not aggressively, casually, almost kindly. People asked questions that assumed a framework. So where is this leading? What's the bigger picture for you? What do you want this to turn into? They weren't imposing meaning. They were offering it, like a chair after standing too long. At first, I declined without effort. I don't know. I'm not building toward anything. This is enough for now. The answers felt true. But over time, something shifted. The absence of meaning began to feel inefficient. Not painful, just unsupported. There was no structure to lean on during difficult days. No promise to soften disappointment. No story to explain why something had to be endured. I realized how often meaning functions as emotional infrastructure. It absorbs weight. Without it, everything lands directly. There were days when that directness felt clean, honest. But there were other days, tired days, when I missed the cushion. That's when the temptation sharpened. What if I didn't need ultimate meaning? What if I just needed a working narrative? Something modest, something temporary, something to make endurance easier. The thought felt reasonable, harmless. I began experimenting with explanation again. Not publicly, internally. I tried framing my days as preparation, as consolidation, as transition. I watched how that framing changed my experience. It worked, and that frightened me. Suddenly, effort felt purposeful again. Discomfort felt justified. Waiting felt strategic. Meaning had returned, quietly, and life became easier to tolerate. But something else returned with it. Distance. I noticed I was no longer fully in my days. I was living through them again. Toward something. For something. The immediacy I had learned to trust began to fade. Meaning was doing what it always does. It was organizing experience, ranking moments, assigning value. I realized then why meaning is so seductive. It offers orientation without presence. You don't have to stay fully here if you believe here is leading somewhere else. That realization stopped me. I paused the experiment and sat with the discomfort that returned when explanation disappeared. It was sharper this time, because I had seen the alternative. I asked myself a difficult question. Was meaning a truth or a coping mechanism? The answer was uncomfortable. It was both. Meaning doesn't lie, but it simplifies. It reduces the complexity of living to a narrative you can carry. Without it, life is heavier, but more precise. I noticed how quickly meaning turns choices into obligations. If this moment is for something, then leaving it becomes failure. Staying becomes duty. Without meaning, choice remains fluid. Responsibility stays local. I began to see how much coercion hides inside purpose. How often people endure what hurts them because it's necessary. How often suffering is romanticized because it's meaningful. I wasn't interested in romanticizing my life anymore. I wanted to live it. But that decision came at a cost. Without meaning, there was no heroic interpretation of difficulty. Pain was just pain. Fatigue was just fatigue. Loss was just loss. There was no elevation. No transformation promised. No reason it had to happen. I grieved that, quietly, because part of me still wanted to believe that everything happened for a reason. That belief had carried me through years. Letting it go felt like standing without a net. I understood then why people cling to meaning even when it suffocates them. It gives suffering a ceiling. Without it, pain feels infinite. But I also noticed something else. Without meaning, pain moved faster. It didn't linger as a story. It passed through as sensation. Raw, then gone. Meaning had prolonged pain by narrating it, turning it into identity, into destiny, into proof. I stopped explaining my discomfort to myself, stopped asking what it was teaching me. I let it be what it was, and that changed its texture. I realized how deeply I'd been trained to convert experience into insight, as if life owed me understanding in exchange for endurance. It doesn't. The more I resisted reintroducing meaning, the more pressure I felt from the world. Subtle pressure, concerned questions, gentle suggestions. People worried I was floating, not grounded, not ambitious. They were wrong. I was grounded differently, without abstraction. But their concern activated doubt, not about my choices, about sustainability. Could I live like this long term, without promise, without payoff, without explanation? That question stayed with me, not anxiously, persistently. I noticed that meaning had always been future-oriented. It deferred satisfaction, deferred rest, deferred acceptance. Without it, everything demanded to be dealt with now. That was exhausting. I learned something important during this phase. Life without meaning requires capacity. You can't outsource endurance to a narrative. You have to carry it yourself. That capacity wasn't constant. Some days I had it. Some days I didn't. On the days I didn't, meaning looked incredibly attractive. I didn't judge myself for that. I observed it. Temptation does not mean error. It means pressure. I began to understand that this phase wasn't about rejecting meaning forever. It was about seeing it clearly, not as truth, not as illusion, as tool, a tool you must decide when to use and when to put down. I wasn't ready to pick it up again, but I also wasn't pretending I never would. That honesty mattered. I lived with the discomfort of openness, with days that didn't point, with effort that didn't accumulate, with experience that didn't resolve. This wasn't emptiness. It was exposure without narrative shelter. And slowly, something changed again. Not dramatically, gradually. I began to sense a different kind of orientation forming. Not meaning, not purpose, something quieter, not an explanation of life, a way of standing inside it. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it approaching, like a posture, like balance. The real test wasn't over. It was deepening. What arrived was not meaning. That surprised me. After resisting it for so long, I expected some alternative explanation to take its place. Something cleaner, more honest. But nothing like that appeared. Instead, something simpler formed. A way of standing inside experience without asking it to justify itself. I realized that I had been confusing two things my entire life: meaning and orientation. Meaning explains. Orientation holds. Meaning tells you why. Orientation tells you how. I no longer needed life to explain itself to me. I needed to know how to meet it. That distinction changed everything. Orientation did not arrive as insight. It arrived as posture. The way I entered a room. The way I listened without preparing responses. The way I noticed when I was pulling away. There was no sentence I could repeat to myself. No belief I could lean on. Only a practice. Returning. Again, I learned that without meaning, responsibility becomes immediate. You can't defer care to a future justification. If something matters, it matters now. If it hurts now. If it ends now. That immediacy felt unforgiving at first, but was also clean. There was no accumulation of narrative residue. No backlog of interpretations. I stopped asking whether I was living correctly. The question itself assumed an external standard. Instead, I asked something narrower. Am I present? Or am I avoiding? That question had teeth. It cut through abstraction. I couldn't answer it theoretically. Only behavior could answer it. I noticed how often I still wanted to turn moments into symbols. This conversation means something. This choice defines me. This phase represents something. Each time I noticed that impulse, I let it go. I didn't lose depth by doing that. I gained proximity. Experience felt closer, less filtered, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes surprisingly light. Without meaning, I no longer needed to endure things I didn't want. I could leave without turning departure into failure. I could stay without turning endurance into virtue. I understood then how much morality hides inside meaning. How often we judge lives not by how they're lived, but by how they're explained. I stopped explaining. People still asked, "Don't you want more? What's the point of this? Aren't you afraid of wasting time?" Their questions were sincere. I didn't argue. I realized that not everyone needs to live this way, and no one needs to understand it. I also realized that life without meaning doesn't remove difficulty. It removes consolation. Pain isn't elevated. Joy isn't promised. Everything arrives unprotected. But that lack of protection did something unexpected. It made me gentler. With myself. With others. Without narratives, suffering didn't need to be justified. It needed to be met. I began responding instead of interpreting. If someone was tired, I listened. If I was tired, I rested. If something ended, I grieved, without turning any of it into a lesson. This didn't make life smaller. It made it more precise. I noticed how often people use meaning to escape contact, to tolerate relationships they've outgrown, to stay in jobs that hollow them, to explain away quiet despair. I didn't want to do that anymore. Without meaning, choice became more frequent, more uncomfortable, more honest. There was no framework to blame. If I stayed, I stayed. If I left, I left. Responsibility was immediate and personal. I realized that this way of living isn't heroic. It doesn't scale. It doesn't look impressive. It offers no story, but offers something else. Integrity without performance. I stopped imagining my life as something to be understood later. I stopped asking whether it would make sense in retrospect. I accepted that it might never. And that was fine. There was a quiet peace in that acceptance. Not relief. Not happiness. Peace. I noticed how often I had confused peace with resolution. Resolution closes. Peace stays open. Without meaning, life remained unfinished. But I was no longer rushing to finish it. I felt time differently. Not as something to be used well, but as something to move with. I didn't need to get it right. I needed to stay awake. I understood then that this wasn't nihilism. It was intimacy without explanation. If something mattered, I cared. Not because it represented something, because it was here. I didn't become indifferent. I became selective. Without meaning, energy is precious. You don't spend it on abstractions. I also understood why this path isn't common. It offers no reassurance, no validation, no narrative comfort, only contact. And contact requires courage. Every day, I don't know what comes next. I don't need to. The future no longer owes me coherence. If there is any wisdom left here, it is this. You don't need your life to mean something in order to live it fully. You need to meet it honestly. I live now without explanation, without promise, without defense, not empty, not lost, just present. And that is enough.